Okay, well, welcome. My name is Andrew Krepanevich. I'm president of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. And we're joined today with colleagues from three of our sister think tanks. We have Tom Donnelly here from the American Enterprise Institute, Bob Work for the Center for New American Security, my colleague Jim Thomas, Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, and Clark Murdoch at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And the reason we're here, well, you have to kind of go back about 18 months or so when the Budget Control Act was passed. And initially it was assumed that somehow this couldn't possibly happen and we would all find a way to work around it. And here we are some months later, and we're now living it. And it looks like we may have to live with it for a long time. And the purpose here is for these four think tanks to brief out the results of a strategic planning exercise that they engaged in last week, the four think tanks together, each working the issue independently. And the idea was to take a serious look at the implications of sequestration, but to do so within a strategic context. That is to say, not view the challenge of sequestration simply as a cut drill, which required a haircut in Pentagon parlance, but actually an opportunity and also a challenge to reorient defense priorities in a way that supported a coherent strategy. You have their bios, these four gentlemen here, who are going to each present, so I won't bore you with them, although they are all impressive. The way we're going to proceed is that first, Todd Harrison, my colleague at CSBA, will give you a presentation on the planning tool that was used by each of the four groups to come up with their approach to the sequestration cuts. And there is an option A and an option B. Option A is sort of the full Monty. It's $522 billion in cuts between FY14 and FY23. The kinder, gentler option B calls for roughly $247 billion in cuts over the same time frame. And again, these are not cuts that any of us are, any of our think tanks are advocating. It's rather an attempt to live within the constraints of the real world. Following Todd's explication, we'll go in alphabetical order according to think tanks. So we'll start with Tom Donnelly and work our way down to Clark Murdoch. Each, in order to save time, sufficient time for questions, each person will have 10 minutes. I'll be sitting there, and I know these guys. And, you know, absent a tranquilizer dart, which I don't have, it's going to be a challenge for me to keep them under 10 minutes. So when you see me stand up and walk over there, I think the appropriate response on your part is to start mumbling for shame, or something along those lines. And I'm not even sure that will work, but you ought to give it a try. So again, I would also point out that there are no magic solutions here. You know, strategy involves making hard choices. The kind of cuts we're talking about require hard choices, requiring deciding not only what you're going to do, but what you're not going to do. And I think that's very important. And again, we didn't give people the option for, hey, come, you know, here are $500 billion worth of efficiency savings, and so everything stays the same and we all go home happy tonight. That's been a hardy perennial whenever it comes time to cut the defense budget. I've been around longer than I care to admit. It's an attractive option, but all it does is to defer the hard choices. And we did not give these people the opportunity to do that, and I think you'll see it in their presentations today. Once they're finished, Todd will come up and he'll give you a brief overview of where the four groups really came together in terms of areas where they thought we really needed to invest maybe even more than we're investing now despite the cuts, but also areas where we could take some risk, an acceptable level of risk, even with reduced funding. So enough of me. Let's turn it over to the talent here. And Todd, why don't you take over and give them the rundown? Thank you.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out. I will take you through quickly the premise of the exercise and the challenge that we gave to all the teams represented here. So the objective here was for the teams to take their own strategy, their own approach for rebalancing the defense budget over the next 10 years and put it into action, and do so under the constraints, under the stress, if you will, of budget cuts. And so we devised this to operate over 2 FYDPs. The first FYDP, FY 14 to 18, the second FYDP, 19 to 23. And we gave them 2 different budget scenarios, 2 different levels of cuts. And the idea was to explore what are the major trade-offs you have to make, where are the areas where you're going to invest no matter what, where are the areas where you're going to cut no matter what, and where are the areas where you're going to have to take risk because of the budget cuts. And the idea here was to keep it focused on what are the major capability trades, not get bogged down in specific program choices as you do this, but keep it at a level of, what are the big capabilities that are going to be most important and least important going in the future. A note here, the results you're going to see today from these 4 teams represent the opinions and the options selected by these 4 teams. They do not necessarily represent institutional positions of the think tanks they come from. So just want to state that up front. So we made several assumptions going into this exercise. We started with the 2012 Defense Strategic Guidance. Gave that to all the teams. Of course, they had already read it and studied it quite a bit, I'm sure. And said, hey, use this as a starting point, and you can go wherever you want with your strategy. So just tell us how you're changing it from the current strategic guidance. And then we gave them, as I said before, 2 budget level cuts. But we did revise things a bit for the purposes of the exercise. We gave them virtually complete flexibility in what to target in their budget cuts and in their ads. Of course, political reality sets in, and you realize that you can't do everything that you would like to do because you do have to get 535 members of Congress to consider it. We also we ran the budget cuts over a 10-year period, so it would be a nice even 2 FYDPs. That extended through FY 23. And keep in mind that the Budget Control Act, the caps in the Budget Control Act, they actually end in FY 21. We just did a straight line extension of them for an extra 2 years. And we also gave them the flexibility, instead of trying to make their budget balance each year in the 10-year period, which would have taken a lot longer, we just said, look, you've got to balance it and reach the target level of cuts in each FYDP. So they were able to move money implicitly within each FYDP. All of those things made it a little easier to do this. The bottom bullet point here I want to emphasize, we also started them with some very generous assumptions. We let them assume that all of the proposed compensation reform in the 2013 budget request, so things like raising TRICARE fees, reducing the growth in basic pay, things like that, we let them assume that all of that actually happens. So your compensation costs are not growing out of control. You actually have modest growth in compensation costs. And so we didn't give them an option in the game to do anything else with compensation reform. We said, look, we're just assuming it's already in there. It's already baked in. That's a generous assumption, of course. And keep in mind, as people show you all of their cuts, that if you don't get that compensation reform, you would actually have to cut a lot more. Also, efficiency initiatives that Andrew mentioned, we let them assume that all of the efficiencies DOD has already banked the savings for from the last, I think, 3 budget requests. We let them assume that all of those efficiencies come true. And of course, it's highly unlikely that all of the efficiencies will come true and they will be able to realize every bit of those savings. But nevertheless, we let them assume that they would get all those efficiencies, and then we did not give them an option to add even more efficiencies to it. So those are 2 pretty generous assumptions, and I just point that out to keep in mind as people present their results. It would be a lot worse had we not given them these easy assumptions. So our approach here, each team got to individually go through and develop their own rebalancing strategy. We had them use our tool, which I'll show you a few pictures of that in a second, to make their investment and divestment decisions over the 2 FYDPs. The 2 scenarios for budget cuts, scenario A was the full BCA level cuts. Over that 10-year period, so extended out to FY23, that would amount to $522 billion in cuts relative to the baseline. The baseline is the FY13 budget request and projection. Scenario B, we said, hey, you get to buy something back. We're only going to give you half the cuts under the BCA, and we're going to backload them. And so it's actually a little easier to do that if the cuts are disproportionately made in the second fight-up. And so I'll show you what this looks like graphically. The dashed blue line you see on the top, that's the baseline that all of the adds and cuts were being made from. Scenario A, the full BCA cuts, you can see that's what the cuts add up to, $260 billion in that first fight-up, $261 billion in the second fight-up. Scenario B, the half Budget Control Act cuts that are backloaded. You see it's a gradual ramp down, as you see in that orange line there. So the cuts build over time. It's only $56 billion in cuts in the first fight-up, $191 billion in cuts in the second fight-up. And that actually makes a big difference, whether or not the cuts are backloaded when you play this through. And I'll show you the rebalancing tool that we used. It had over 650 different options of things to add or cut. So the teams had plenty of things to choose from, to invest in and divest of. The options, since there's so many of them, they're organized by category. And we organized them not by service, but by capability areas, if you will. So the air category, keep in mind as people show you their results, air includes all aircraft, not just Air Force aircraft. So they could go through, they could look at descriptions of the options, what it would do, how much it would save them in the first fight-up, how much it would save them in the second fight-up, and they could select different increments, you know, the number of BCTs they would want to add or cut, the number of aircraft they would want to add or cut. They have all that flexibility in the tool. So without saying more, I will turn it over to Tom to go through his team's presentation.